According to the most recent information from archaeologists, the first human beings arrived in Florida at least 14,000 years ago. It was the late Pleistocene Ice Age, and glaciers covered much of North America. With so much of Earth's water locked up at the poles as ice, global sea levels were about 200 feet lower than they are today, and Florida was much bigger. The Florida platform extends 100 miles into the Gulf of Mexico and is mostly submerged. The Florida we know is just the part that sticks above water today. 14,000 years ago, the entire plateau was above water. Tampa would have been about in the center of the state. There's actually evidence for a large freshwater lake in the middle of what's now Tampa Bay. Florida was also a lot cooler and drier back then. Instead of a subtropical climate, it was a savanna grassland that was home to animals like the woolly mammoth, giant sloth, and saber-toothed tiger. We don't know much about the first people to live in Florida. Like us, they preferred to live along the coast, and so any coastal settlements are now under 200 feet of water. Archaeologists have found beautifully crafted stone tools from this period, and an underwater cave in Sarasota County yielded several human skeletons dating back about 10,000 years, but their culture remains a puzzle for scientists to piece together. By about 2,000 years ago, sea level had basically stabilized where it is today. 500 years ago, we have the earliest detailed accounts of the people living in Florida and their society. These come to us from the Spanish priests, scholars, and scribes who arrived with the explorations of the 1500s. This illustration by contemporary artist Theodore Morris shows us some of the largest American Indian nations in Florida at the start of the 16th century. Notice that I use the word nation instead of tribe. A tribe is a group linked by traditions of common descent, language, and culture, but a nation is a stable community of people linked by territory, history, and politics. These were secular, political states with well-defined borders, and thus they were nations. You had the Calusa in southwest Florida, the Tequesta, Jaga, and Miami in the southeast, the Timucua and Ocala in central Florida, the Appalachee in the Panhandle, and the Tocobaga around Tampa Bay. The name Seminole is not on this map, but we'll discuss them more in a moment. The Tocobaga people dominated the Tampa Bay area politically and economically. Tocobaga territory in the year 1500 extended along the Gulf Coast from the area north of Crystal River all the way south to Charlotte Harbor. The Tocobaga Nation consisted of a few dozen semi-independent towns and villages, each with their own cacique, or political leader. These local caciques were in turn vassals of a great cacique who may himself have been called Tocobaga, and who ruled from their principal city at the head of Old Tampa Bay in present-day Safety Harbor. The Tocobaga lived during the Mississippian cultural era, 1000 AD to 1600 AD. The nations of this time period were probably the first in Florida to separate church and state. Prior to the Mississippian, the religious leaders were also political leaders, but the Tocobaga and their contemporaries changed that. The Tocobaga were a matrilineal society, tracing their lineage back through the female line of their family tree. Women could also become leaders, and it may not have been uncommon to have both a male and female cacique at the same time. A few Tocobaga villages may have specialized in agriculture. Amaranth was probably a favorite cereal crop, as it was suited to our climate and soil type, and corn was likely brought in from the Pasco area. The Tocobaga also ground acorns and hickory nuts into meal, prepared the roots of green briar, spatterdock, and kunti for starch, and harvested the berries and tender hearts of palmetto plants. The Tocobaga collected sea grapes, muscadine grapes, and prickly pears, but they did not eat oranges, since oranges are native to China and arrived in Florida with the Spanish. They dried grapes to make raisins, but oddly there was no evidence of any fermentation with the intent to produce ethanol, and it appears the Tocobaga were not familiar with alcoholic brews. The main industry of the Tocobaga was fishing. These were expert fishermen who used an array of very modern-looking equipment such as basket traps, gill nets, hooks, lures, and sinkers. They traveled by canoe and built temporary fish camps on the barrier islands, but their permanent villages were always located on the mainland, since the barrier islands offered no protection from hurricanes and often no freshwater sources. The vast majority of Tocobaga towns were built near estuaries. An estuary is a place where saltwater and freshwater mix. The lower salinity and reduced wave action make estuaries a preferred spawning ground for fish, and the perfect environment for crustaceans, oysters, and other mollusks. Tocobaga cities and towns were characterized by large mounds of earth or shell that kept their homes and temples safe from heavy rains and storm surge. Some of the largest mounds in Florida are made of sand, but the Tocobaga used lots of shell since it was so abundant in their territory and made an excellent foundation material. They constructed seawalls, berms, and jetties to control the flow of water, and they built raised platforms near the center of most towns called plazas that functioned like a town square. Unfortunately, modern 20th century developers also found shell to be a good building material, and so most of the Tocobaga shell mounds were dismantled to be used as roadbeds and foundations. But you can take a tour of a particularly well-preserved one at the Jungle Prada site in St. Petersburg. A Tocobaga house was large and usually held an extended family. Houses had high ceilings in order to allow hot air to rise and were supported by wooden posts carefully carved with clan symbols and other decorations. A great house for the cacique was usually built on top of one of the mounds, and a temple was built on a temple mound. Burial mounds could be located near the village or may have been built on small offshore islands. Some Tocobaga specialized in making fine pottery. Clay was gathered from local streams or creeks, tempered and aged. Vessels were shaped and decorated by hand and then fired in a temporary dugout kiln. Some highly elaborate ceramics, dubbed prestige ware, indicate a division in social classes and a society that had specialists. Although Florida lacks metal resources, the Tocobaga participated in a huge trade network that extended over the entire eastern half of North America. They acquired gold from the gold regions of North Georgia at the headwaters of the Appalachian River. They obtained copper from as far away as Lake Superior and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and used it to create elaborate jewelry and personal adornments. In return, the Tocobaga supplied this trade network with goods like seashells, dried fish, and the roasted leaves of a special plant called the yaupon holly. Yaupon holly grows abundantly in coastal Florida and contains significant levels of caffeine. It was used to make an important beverage called the black drink. The roasted stems and leaves were boiled in water and strained to make a dark brown liquid that was served hot and packed more caffeine than a cup of coffee. The arrival of the first Europeans to Florida spelled disaster for the Tocobaga, even though they never actually fought a war with them. Spaniard Pedro Menendez even tried to help broker a peace between the warring Tocobaga and Calusa nations when he visited Tampa Bay around 1570. It was the invisible army of European germs and diseases to which the Tocobaga had no immunity that caused their ultimate decline. Smallpox had the most dramatic effect, but typhoid fever, measles, and cholera all took their toll on Florida's native population. Estimates vary, but most agree that within the first 100 years after the appearance of the Spanish, the population of Florida and the Tocobaga was reduced by as much as 90%. Cities and towns began to disappear, and with their society so badly disrupted, some surviving Tocobaga left to accept paid work for the Spanish as couriers and guides. Eventually no longer able to defend their territory from outside invaders, the Tocobaga left Tampa Bay for good. Some moved north, while others left Florida completely and followed the Spanish to Cuba after Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in 1763. The British never established much of a presence in Florida. It would be other American Indian groups who came to pick up the pieces. They were predominantly Creek, Yamasee, and Muskogee people who were fleeing British-controlled slave colonies further north. These people were collectively called the Seminoles, possibly arising from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or free man. Any Tocobaga people who were still living in Florida were likely absorbed culturally into the new Seminole nation. Today, the Tocobaga are not a federally recognized tribe, but their descendants may still live in Florida as part of the Seminoles. On our guided tour of the Jungle Prada site in St. Petersburg, you can see the best preserved Tocobaga shell mound in Tampa Bay. This typical small fishing village on the coast of Boca Ciega Bay features a shell mound over 800 feet long and part of the ancient village plaza. You'll learn even more about the Tocobaga, see examples of their pottery and other artifacts on display, and explore our garden full of native plants they would have used in their everyday life. You can even sample the black drink, that caffeinated tea they made from the yaupon holly bush. Visit www.discoverfloridatours.com for details about the tours, or call 727-430-2677. As always, thank you for watching this video about the Tocobaga people of Tampa Bay and for discovering Florida with us.